Can a thirst for vengeance truly summon the horrors of the underworld? How deep must a family cut before the spiritual world demands blood? A terrifying Indonesian story of ancient sin, black magic, and the absolute destruction of a bloodline. This is the kind of story whispered about in hushed tones, the kind that confirms our deepest fears, that some sins are so profound, they are written in a book bound for hell itself. We are diving deep into a terrifying chain of events that unfolded when a young woman, Tika, a girl devoted to her studies at the madrasa, found her world shattering around her. Her entire family was targeted, set to be eradicated by a powerful queen of the Djinn, summoned from across 7 vast seas, all because of a sinister act of black magic. The motive? Vengeance. A lifetime of agonizing neglect, burning hatred, and ceaseless abuse finally culminated in one family member choosing the darkest possible path to exact revenge. Could Tika possibly unmask this hidden enemy? Was there any defense against this ancient, terrifying Djinn? And ultimately, could Tika survive the fallout of such a horrific, foundational curse? To understand this chilling narrative, a story crafted around the absolute worst sins humanity can commit, those very deeds recorded in the Kitab Sijjin, we must venture directly into the darkness. Our story begins one harrowing night in a small, humble home in Indonesia. The scene is quiet, domestic, seemingly peaceful, a mother, father, and their daughter Yuli gathered around the dinner table. But this tranquility was a fragile facade, because Yuli's mother Sukma was desperately ill, suffering from an ailment no medicine could touch. Suddenly the air filled with Sukma's anguished cries. She began to writhe and spasm in unbearable torment. Yuli and her father watched, frozen in absolute terror. Then, the impossible happened. Terrifying strands of barbed wire began to visibly puncture and emerge from the flesh of her hands. It was painfully clear that she had been targeted by a dark and malicious force. She was caught in the grip of black magic. The horror intensified as fragments of barbed wire ripped through her eyes. Overwhelmed by agonizing pain, Sukma convulsed and instinctively grabbed Yuli's arm. The pressure was immense, causing immediate, painful wounds to tear open on Yuli's flesh. Yuli's father, frantic with desperation, lunged forward. He managed somehow to tear Yuli free from the cursed grip of his wife, rushing his terrified daughter to her room. He desperately tried to reassure Yuli, promising that he would fix everything, urging her to wait inside while he returned to watch over her mother. He stepped out, closing and locking the door behind him. Then came the sounds that shattered Yuli's young life forever. From the confinement of her bedroom, Yuli could only hear the gut-wrenching screams of her father, quickly followed by the primal, monstrous roar of her mother. Fear gripped her soul. In that moment of utter chaos, the lights abruptly died, plunging the house into suffocating darkness. She heard heavy, violent impacts against the door. Someone or something was attempting to smash it down. Yuli huddled in terror. A powerful force managed to splinter a section of the door. Through the jagged gap, she knew what waited on the other side. Her mother, Suma, now completely transformed, twisted into a demonic, horrifying entity. Just like that, the terrifying scene ended. When Yuli finally awoke the next morning, it was to the sound of police intervention. She cautiously left her room and found a sight that instantly broke her, the lifeless bodies of her mother and father lying cold before her. She wept uncontrollably. As the tragedy unfolded, a woman arrived, accompanied by a small child. This introduction revealed a complex and painful family dynamic. The woman was Yuli's stepmother, Amber, and the child was her stepsister. Amber, cold and cruel even in the face of death, immediately confronted Yuli, showering her with abuse and labeling her an illegitimate child. And with that heartbreaking scene, 2 decades passed. 20 years later, Yuli was still living in the same complex, under the roof of her stepmother and stepsister. Her stepsister, Laras, had since married a man named Rudy, and they had 2 children, Tika and Djinn. Amber, now aged and frail, was perpetually unwell. Yuli's life had been utterly defined by servitude. Though she was technically a daughter of the house, Yuli was treated as nothing more than a domestic worker. Since childhood, she had dutifully performed all the household chores and cared tirelessly for Amber, despite her sacrifices. Yuli was never afforded kindness or respect. She was never treated as a member of the family. Amber, in particular, harbored a visceral hatred for her. Yet Yuli endured it all in silent resignation. This family, however cruel, was the only one she had left in the world. At this time, we meet Tika, the daughter of Laras and Rudy, a dedicated student attending the madrasa. One day, in class, her religious teacher, the Oustad, spoke of profound spiritual concepts, the Kitab Sijjin, the terrifying registry where all human evils and wicked deeds are eternally recorded, and Ilion, the counterpart that records all good deeds. After her lesson concluded, Tika returned home with her friends. The atmosphere there was vastly different from the sanctity of the madrasa. Downstairs in Amber's room, her young brother Djinn was obsessively playing with a Ouija board. He firmly believed this board would allow him to communicate with the spirits of the departed. Following the prescribed rules of the deadly game, Djinn began to call out to the dead. Suddenly, the door to the room swung open on its own. Djinn recoiled in fright, but it wasn't a ghost. It was Yuli, entering the room to help clean and tend to Amber. Tika quickly followed, seeing her younger brother sitting there. "Dan, what are you doing here?" Tika asked him. When Djinn explained the Ouija board, Tika strictly warned him against believing in such dangerous things. Just then, Amber's condition rapidly worsened. Djinn, undeterred by Tika's warning, turned to Yuli and asked a philosophical question, testing the waters. Did she ever believe in speaking to the dead? Yuli admitted that as a child, after her parents were murdered, as she perceived it, she often wished she could speak to them. The moment the words left Yuli's lips, Amber's breathing grew terribly strained. She struggled violently for air. Tika ran to fetch her mother, Laras. Yuli, meanwhile, approached Amber with the oxygen mask. In a shocking display of final malice, Amber snatched the mask away and threw it aside. She grabbed Yuli, her eyes burning with contempt, and snarled that Yuli's parents deserved their gruesome deaths. With a burst of strength, she shoved Yuli away. Laras and Rudy burst into the room. Amber's condition was now critical. As her life ebbed away, blood violently erupted from her mouth, and she spat it directly onto Yuli. Yuli stood stunned, drenched in her tormentor's blood, feeling the deepest possible pain, physical and emotional. Even in her final, wheezing breath, Amber's eyes were fixed on Yuli, filled with unconcealed loathing and hatred. Yuli simply watched, while the rest of the family descended into heartbroken cries. The next morning, crowds gathered following the news of Amber's death. Yuli, as always, managed all the necessary arrangements. However, when it came time for the ritual bathing and preparation of the body, janaza, Laras appeared, stern and cold, and harshly ordered Yuli out of the room. Only immediate family members were permitted, she declared. This blatant exclusion stung Yuli deeply, and Tika, witnessing her mother's cruelty, was also disturbed. Yet Yuli offered no retort. She simply stepped outside and began preparing the shroud cloth. The moment arrived for the final farewells. The Oustad instructed the family to approach the body one by one. Yuli stepped forward last. As she approached Amber's corpse, her mind flooded with painful flashbacks of her childhood, the constant, cruel abuse, the utter humiliation being forced to eat scraps of food that had fallen onto the floor. Consumed by these devastating memories, Yuli's attention suddenly snapped back to the present. She froze. Amber's eyes were open. Yuli's rational mind screamed at her, "She's dead. She has passed away." But then, as if a direct curse was spoken from the corpse, Yuli heard a terrifying pronouncement of death and damnation meant for her. She shrieked in terror. Laras immediately flew into a furious rage. She viewed Yuli's terrified cry as an act of calculated mockery. Right there, in front of everyone, Laras slapped Yuli hard across the face. She accused Yuli of being gleeful over Amber's death, claiming that Yuli was staging a pathetic scene even during the last moments of the woman who had raised her since she was a child. Laras wept tears of self-pity and fury, and poor Yuli, shattered and unable to defend herself, remained silent. Before the burial, Laras sat alone, staring at old photographs of her parents. She remembered the source of her lifelong pain. Her father had left them to live with Yuli and her mother, Sukma, denying Laras the love and warmth Yuli had received. This bitter realization had festered for decades. In a moment of raging resentment, Laras tore her father's picture to shreds. At the cemetery, Laras, Rudy, and the children grieved visibly. But Yuli, after the public humiliation, felt no emotion towards them. The local community, having witnessed Laras's brutal behavior, began gossiping and making nasty comments about Yuli. This unjust condemnation was the last straw. The next day, while Yuli worked at the family shop alongside Laras, the final, unforgivable incident occurred. Yuli caught Yuno, one of their employees, attempting to hide and pocket cash. Yuli swiftly confiscated the money, intending to hand it over to Laras, but Laras walked in just as Yuli held the money. Instantly, Laras accused Yuli of stealing. She began to play the victim, screaming insults and branding Yuli as morally corrupt and bad, just like her mother. When Yuli tried to defend herself, Laras slapped her again, escalating the public confrontation. "You dare speak now?" "Of course you do," Laras spat, tearing into Yuli. Laras claimed Yuli was only brave because Umber, who had supposedly provided Yuli with shelter and care, was now dead. Laras twisted the narrative, painting Yuli as the villain to the gathered public. The injustice was overwhelming. Even Yuno, the man Yuli had just caught stealing, felt terrible sympathy for her. When Yuno approached Yuli to console her, she broke down, weeping uncontrollably, and begged him for help. Yuno agreed. He drove Yuli far away to the secluded home of a black magic shaman. Upon arrival, Yuli paid Yuno a substantial amount of cash before entering the compound. The shaman, Salmon, recognized her immediately. And here is where the chilling truth was revealed. Yuli had hired Salmon to perform black magic on Amber, resulting in her successful death. But now, Yuli was back, driven by a new, more profound and terrifying goal. She demanded the complete and utter destruction of Laras's entire family. Laras's cruelty, Yuli declared, was even worse than Amber's. Yuli wanted them to suffer severely, not just becoming blind or disabled. She wanted them to writhe in agony before they died. Salmon warned her that this was an incredibly dangerous endeavor. Was she ready to accept the profound risk? Yuli was resolute. She was ready to do anything to see Laras's family annihilated. Salmon led Yuli into a dark inner chamber and began the terrifying ritual. He held photographs of Laras's family in one hand. In the other, he held a scattering of sharp nails, which he dropped onto a plate. As Salmon began chanting the forbidden incantations, he gestured towards the nails. Eerily, the nails began to visibly twitch and move. At the same time, the photographs in his other hand burst into flames. Yuli watched, mesmerized and horrified. Salmon then delivered the next instruction, a task so repulsive it turned Yuli's stomach. To fulfill her dark wish, she needed to retrieve a specific kind of corpse, one that had been buried for less than 40 days. This decaying body was essential for the continuance of the black magic. Yuli asked the critical question, what if the required body was that of a family member? Salmon simply replied, that would be even better. To seal the pact and initiate her into the next level of the ritual, Salmon held a lit cigarette and burned Yuli's hand. He then forced her to perform part of the ritual herself. That very night, Yuli and Yuno drove to the cemetery. They approached Amber's grave. With sickening determination, they dug up the earth and exhumed the corpse of Amber. The smell of the partially decomposed body was almost unbearable, making them gag and retch. Yet, struggling with immense effort, they pulled the putrefying remains from the ground and loaded them onto Yuno's truck. They transported the horrific cargo back to Salmon's house. Salmon told Yuno to wait outside while he guided Yuli through the second, much deeper ritual. The room was prepared with sacrifices. First, a goat was slaughtered, then a black rooster. Finally, black eggs were utilized. These components were used to perform the ritual designed to bind the Djinn. A talisman, a small scroll, was prepared and inscribed with Amber's name. Yuli took blood onto her hand and smeared it across her face. Her task was to insert this talisman into Amber's corpse. She held the amulet near Amber's face and began chanting the spells alongside Salmon. As she chanted, reality dissolved. She was instantaneously transported to the cold, dark depths of the grave, finding herself entangled in the winding shroud. Yet she did not cease the spell. She repeated the incantations again and again. When she snapped back to the reality of Salmon's chamber, the ritual was complete. A vile slug or leech emerged from Amber's mouth. The corpse's jaw instinctively dropped open. Yuli quickly slipped the talisman deep inside. Immediately, Amber's mouth clamped shut. Salmon looked at Yuli, confirming her power. Their deaths were now assured. But wait, there was a condition that hung heavy in the air. Yuli must continue performing the ritual regularly. If she failed to complete the black magic before Amber's body fully decomposed, the Djinn would turn on her. Salmon warned her to remember that the Djinn favored the sinful. Yuli must ensure that those she targeted Laras' family remained corrupted and evil in the eyes of the spiritual world. Back at the house, Tika was performing the Isha prayer. This was the exact moment the evil was unleashed. A searing fireball was seen streaking toward and entering the family home. The Djinn had arrived. Suddenly, the glass in the window violently shattered. Through the broken pane, an ominous, watchful eye peered into the room. Tika, engrossed in her prayer, sensed an oppressive, unnatural atmosphere. Downstairs, the family photograph hanging in the living room suddenly crashed to the floor. Tika rushed through her prayer, ending it quickly so she could investigate the loud noise. As she approached the broken photo frame, a shard of shattered glass immediately sliced into her foot. The pain was sharp and intense. As she bent to pull the glass out, she heard a sickening, muffled groaning coming from her deceased grandmother's room nearby. Tika bravely entered the room, but found it empty. As she was leaving, a washbowl resting on the bed abruptly clattered to the floor. As Tika bent to retrieve it, she was confronted by a terrifying vision. The screaming spirit of her grandmother. She cried out in paralyzing fear. Just then Yuli appeared. Tika, shaking and desperate, tried to explain everything she had just experienced, the strange noises, the apparition. Yuli, feigning calm, simply dismissed it, suggesting Tika must have imagined the whole thing. She gently ushered Tika back to her room. Yuli walked away, a sinister sense of satisfaction blooming in her heart. The black magic was working. The next morning, as Tika's foot was being bandaged, Djinn explained that he too had experienced something strange the previous night. He admitted that he had been trying to communicate with the dead using the Ouija board, and his grandmother's spirit had responded, saying she was in terrible pain. Tika, disturbed but firm in her faith, declared that she would arrange a doa, a prayer ceremony, to be held in the house that evening for her grandmother. Laras didn't seem to think it was necessary, but Tika's persistence won her agreement. At that moment, Yuli walked in, dressed smartly, fully prepared to leave the house. Laras, still reeling from grief, immediately demanded to know why Yuli was dressed up and not preparing the house for the evening's prayer ceremony. She ordered Yuli to manage all the preparation work. But this Yuli was different. The servitude was over. "I will not be doing anything today," Yuli stated plainly. Laras was shocked by the defiance. Where was Yuli suddenly getting this courage, especially since Amber died? Yuli gave no reply, simply walking out of the house. Laras' anger flared, but Tika intervened, attempting to calm her mother. It was noted, however, that while Yuli was openly contemptuous toward Laras, she spoke to Rudy, Laras' husband, with suspicious kindness. Tika, still deeply troubled, sought counsel at the madrasa. She recounted the terrifying events to her teacher, the sensation of an intruder, and the disturbing sight of her grandmother's likeness. She desperately asked if a dead person's soul could return. The wise Oustad firmly explained that this was impossible. Upon death, the punishment of the grave immediately begins. If Tika saw an apparition resembling her relative, it was unequivocally a Djinn. Tika was plunged into deeper anxiety. That night, Tika's Oustad arrived to lead the doa ceremony. Tika, unable to shake the dread, kept her eyes fixed on the family portrait. Suddenly, Tika's eyes snapped shut. When she opened them, she was no longer in the living room. She saw her entire family standing before her, but they were mutilated. Blood flowed freely from the top of every single head, and they were screaming in silent anguish. Tika couldn't bear the horrific sight. She screamed, snapping back to reality. Terrified, she clung to her mother, weeping. Meanwhile, tragedy was unfolding in the grandmother's room. Dion, ignoring the prayer ceremony, was sitting alone, obsessively trying to communicate with Amber using the Ouija board. The coin began to move erratically, seemingly of its own accord. Dion was momentarily frightened, yet he still believed he was connecting with his grandmother's spirit. But we know the truth. At that exact moment, Yuli was performing the ritual, preparing a talisman specifically inscribed with Dion's name. She inserted the amulet deep into Amber's throat. As she chanted the dark spell, she cinched the corpse's throat tightly shut. The coin on the Ouija board spelled out a chilling instruction for Diane: go with Grandma. Diane grew pale with fear. Suddenly, a large fly buzzed violently into Diane's ear, lodging itself deep inside. Diane was overcome with excruciating pain. He staggered out of the room, but the fly continued to torment him, drilling agony into his head. He began to scream, frantically calling for his mother and father. The prayer ceremony had just finished. Tika, passing by, heard her brother's agonizing screams. She rushed to the door, shouting for Dion to open it. Inside, Dion was completely losing control. He was thrashing his own head violently against a nearby cupboard. Injured and disoriented, he managed to pull himself together and tried to stumble toward the door. But the powerful, invisible force of the Djinn slammed into him, stopping him cold. His hands began to move against his will, forced by the supernatural entity. He picked up the Ouija board. Tika, desperate, finally managed to shoulder the door open. She watched, horrified, as Diane brought the wooden board down onto his own head, cracking it. Diane, however, wasn't seeing Tika. He was seeing the terrifying, demonic image of Amber's ghost. In the final, gruesome act, the Djinn took a sharp, broken shard of the Ouija board and violently shoved it deep into Dion's neck. Dion collapsed, his young life brutally extinguished. Tika's scream tore through the night. Rudy and Laras raced in, stumbling over their son's lifeless body, their cries of anguish joining Tika's. Yuno, who had arrived for the Doa, was also present. Dion's terrifying death shook him to his core. He knew, deep down, that Yuli was responsible for these spiraling catastrophes. He had seen her repeatedly at Amber's grave. As he was leaving the cemetery, Yuno confronted Yuli, his voice laced with dread. "Did you cause Dion's death?" he asked. Yuno reminded her that he had helped her only because she had been wronged. He never intended for murder, especially not the murder of her nephew. Yuli responded with callous indifference. She declared that Laras' family had never recognized her as one of their own. What was happening now was simply karma, and they were finally reaping the consequences of their actions. With that cold justification, she walked away. Yuno was left sickened by the entire affair. If you're finding this terrifying story of supernatural revenge and the Djinn Queen compelling, hit that like button and let us know in the comments which part scared you the most. Your support helps us keep bringing you these deep dives into cinematic horror. Meanwhile, Tika was sobbing uncontrollably before the Oustad. She was overwhelmed by guilt, believing she should have taken the Ouija board away from Diane. She felt instinctively that this wasn't natural. Her family was being systematically targeted. The Oustad offered her guidance based on faith. The Oustad urged Tika not to despair. She must rise for the Tahajjud, late-night prayer, and ask Allah SWT for help with sincerity. That night, Tika followed his advice. As she performed the Tahajjud and poured her heart out in prayer, seeking divine aid, she was suddenly startled. From the darkness next to her, she heard a terrifying, gravelly voice whisper, "Amin." It was the Djinn, mocking her prayers. The Djinn's influence was already clear in the house. Yuli observed the growing chasm between Rudy and Laras. Laras, driven by her focus on the business, insisted on going to the store just a day after their son's death, a move Rudy deeply resented. Yuli saw this rift as her opportunity. At the shop, Laras treated Rudy terribly. When he accidentally dropped and broke a glass bottle, Laras harshly berated him. Rudy had also cut his hand, but Laras ignored his injury. Laras' arrogance stemmed from the fact that Rudy was financially dependent, working for her store and living as a gor jamai, a man living in his wife's house. Sensing his weakness, Yuli approached Rudy. With manufactured tenderness, she applied a bandage and first aid tape to his wounded hand. Rudy was touched by her unexpected kindness. Yuli knew exactly how to proceed with her plan. She deliberately took 2 more glass bottles and smashed them on the floor. She needed Laras to lash out at Rudy again, thus driving the wedge deeper. When Laras started to verbally abuse Yuli for the broken bottles, Rudy suddenly stepped forward. He stood as a shield in front of Yuli, fiercely defending her and finally voicing his own festering resentment toward Laras. He confronted Laras, stating that she had only married him so she could constantly belittle and suppress him. Laras tried to use their dead son against him. Rudy countered, saying he hadn't lost their son alone, he had lost him too. With that, Rudy stormed out and returned home alone. Yuli, seeing her plan progressing perfectly, followed Rudy home. She began aggressively seducing him. Rudy, weak and vulnerable from years of disrespect, succumbed. Entering into an illicit relationship with Yuli, Yuli needed to corrupt Rudy, to make him a sinner in the eyes of the Djinn. During this intimate moment, Laras was relentlessly calling Rudy. When he didn't answer, she decided to drive home herself. Yuli whispered promises to Rudy, urging him to leave everything behind and choose her, assuring him they would find happiness together. Rudy, however, pulled back. He reminded her he had a family. He couldn't choose her. Yuli retaliated with a cruel warning. Once Laras found out about their encounter, Laras herself would drive him away. Rudy, disgusted by his own actions and Yuli's manipulations, grew angry. He declared that Laras was right about her. Yuli was an evil woman, just like her deceased mother. "You can call me anything you want," Yuli snapped back, her eyes flashing dangerously. "But never speak ill of my mother." Rudy immediately fled Yuli's room. Tika, who was nearby, saw Rudy rushing out. She instantly understood the horror of what had just happened. Rudy, ashamed, pleaded with Tika not to tell Laras, promising he would confess to his wife himself. But outside, Laras had already arrived. She was standing there, silent, having witnessed the entire shameful scene. In that moment, she chose to remain quiet, unwilling to confront the reality she had just seen. Later, around 2 a.m., Yuli crept out of the house to continue her dark work. Tika was coincidentally awake, performing her tahajjud prayer. The moment Yuli left, the Djinn immediately turned its attention to Tika. Tika felt the chilling presence behind her, mimicking her every word. Gathering immense courage, Tika whirled around. There was nothing there. She sighed in momentary relief, but then the full, terrifying form of the Djinn materialized right in front of her, sending a fresh wave of paralyzing fear through her. Meanwhile, Yuli had arrived at Saman's lair and commenced the ritual targeting Rudy. She crafted the talisman with Rudy's name and carefully inserted it into Amber's corpse's mouth. She began sewing the corpse's mouth shut. At the same time, miles away in the mosque, Tika's Oustad was intensely praying for the safety of the family. He too felt an unnatural resistance, as if a dark power was actively trying to stop his prayers. Despite the resistance, Yuli managed to sew Amber's mouth shut, completing the black magic. The Oustad's fervent prayers, however, had an unexpected side effect. The lights in Salmon's chamber flickered violently and died. Yuli was terrified, scrambling to relight the space. As she lit the candles, she felt a profound, chilling sensation. She sensed that the corpse behind her had sat up. She dared not look. When she finally turned, everything appeared normal. But as she faced forward, lighting a match to the floorboards, she saw it. The terrifying Djinn was standing directly in front of her. Yuli was paralyzed with fright. Now that the spell was complete, the curse immediately manifested upon Rudy. Rudy awoke suddenly, choking. Something was violently lodged in his throat. He sprinted to the bathroom. Over the sink, he violently coughed up blood, accompanied by a hideous collection of sharp, jagged objects. He was stunned and terrified. As he washed his mouth, a large cockroach suddenly flew up and burrowed deep into his eye socket. Rudy screamed, trying desperately to yank the insect out. The cockroach began to emerge from his other eye socket. In his blind, agonizing frenzy, Rudy tore at his face and inadvertently pulled his own eye completely out of his head. Laras, jolted awake by his blood-curdling screams, pounded on the locked bathroom door. Rudy was screaming for help, unable to save himself. In his final, gruesome moment, the Djinn appeared before him. Rudy collapsed and died. Laras finally broke through the door and let out a shriek of absolute horror upon finding Rudy's mutilated corpse. And outside the house, Yuli listened to that terrifying scream of grief and was filled with malicious satisfaction. If this descent into sheer supernatural horror has your blood pumping, please hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss our next deep dive into the world of curses and consequences. At Rudy's funeral prayers, Yuli couldn't hide her twisted joy, smiling as she watched Laras's devastated state. Yuno noticed Yuli's chilling satisfaction and was now burdened by a profound sense of guilt. Tika, the youngest survivor, was emotionally shattered. She had recognized the Djinn's presence all along, perhaps because her faith, her iman, was strong enough to perceive the evil. During the prayer service, Tika opened her eyes for a fleeting moment and was instantly transported. She found herself in a pitch-black, oppressive cemetery. The only sound was the Oustad's voice, leading the prayer. Following the sound, she prayed through the darkness and dread. As she offered the first salam, the turning of the head to complete the prayer, she was instantly back in the familiar mosque. She turned for the second salam, but before she could finish, the Djinn erupted before her, terrifying her with a monstrous roar. She was violently thrown back into the graveyard. An open grave was waiting. The Djinn grabbed her and dragged her down into the cold, empty hole. Tika was pulled under, suffocating in the earth. She screamed, wrenching herself back to reality. The Oustad and Laras quickly helped Tika, calming her down. The Oustad gave her blessed water to drink. Laras brought her daughter home, where Tika desperately tried to reason with her mother. "Mom, please, you have to believe me. This is not normal." Tika begged. "Only you are left. I can't lose you too. Please, this is black magic." But Laras, blinded by her secular worldview and grief, could not accept it. She still believed Tika was simply hysterical. The next day at the madrasa, the Oustad comforted Tika. He explained that Allah SWT often tests believers with difficult trials. She must maintain a strong heart and continue to seek God's help. Tika accepted his counsel. Meanwhile, back at the house, Laras was falling apart, having lost 3 family members in rapid succession. She heard strange noises coming from Yuli's room. She entered and found Rudy's jacket. Yuli walked in. Laras demanded to know why her deceased husband's jacket was in Yuli's room. Yuli, emboldened by the dark power and her newfound freedom, was completely unapologetic. "You know perfectly well how it got here," Yuli retorted. Laras began to lash out, screaming insults at Yuli, but this time Yuli did not take it. She fought back, hurling insults right back at Laras. For the first time ever, Yuli crossed a line. She struck Laras across the face. Yuli herself seemed shocked by her own physical reaction. Laras had reached her limit. She violently expelled Yuli from the house. Standing outside, Yuli screamed and laughed hysterically at Laras. "You treated me badly since I was a child, and now look at your situation." She gloated, saying Laras should blame herself for the death of her entire family. Yuli declared that they were both at the same level, now both destroyed. Then she vanished into the night. Yuli needed to get back to Sanan's lair to start Laras's final ritual. She sought out Yuno, needing his truck. But she found him speaking quietly with Tika. Yuli grew instantly suspicious, fearing Yuno was confessing everything. Once Tika left, Yuli confronted Yuno. Yuno admitted he hadn't told Tika anything, but he looked Yuli in the eye and declared that he could no longer help such a selfish person. He refused to be an accomplice any further. He even gave back all the money Yuli had paid him and walked back into the store. Yuli was consumed by a blinding rage. Now driven by pure spite, she decided that Yuno too must be punished. That night, Yuno finished his work at the shop and pulled down the metal shutter door. Immediately, the shutter sprang back up on its own. Surprised, he tried to lock it again. It flew open again. He was beginning to realize he wasn't alone. We could see the Djinn standing silently inside the store behind him. Yuno cautiously peered inside. When he looked back, the shutter suddenly slammed down, trapping him inside the dark shop. He heard objects crashing and scattering. He tried to see who was there. The Djinn materialized directly in front of him. Yuno stumbled back in horror. Suddenly, the floor was covered in masses of vile slugs and leeches that began crawling all over him, attempting to enter his mouth. He fought desperately, tearing the disgusting creatures away from his face. He managed to pry open a tiny gap in the metal shutter and began struggling to squeeze through the narrow opening. He was almost out, almost free. But the shutter abruptly flew upward and then crashed down with tremendous force directly onto Yuno's head, killing him instantly. The next morning, Laras and Tika arrived at the store to find the horrific scene. Laras, seeing the violent demise of Yuno, her last remaining employee, completely broke down. Tika tried to console her weeping mother. From a distance, Yuli watched, thrilled by the chaos and destruction. That very night, Yuli went back to Salmon's lair and performed the ritual for Laras. She inserted Laras's talisman into Amber's rapidly decaying body. Back at the house, Tika was sitting alone in her room, looking at the family photos. Suddenly, insects began to swarm the pictures. Tika looked up and saw a crack in the ceiling. She moved away just as a section of the plaster and ceiling material crashed down. The lights went out. In the darkness, Tika used her phone flashlight and saw broken fragments of bone lying on the floor. Ignoring the horror, she rushed out to find her mother. Laras's room was utterly destroyed, furniture overturned, objects scattered everywhere. Laras was gone. Tika shone her light across the floor. A hand shot out from beneath the bed. Tika screamed in terror. Her mother, Laras, was completely under the control of the evil Djinn. Laras advanced on Tika, her eyes vacant, proclaiming that they would all soon be dead. Tika, terrified but grounded in her faith, began to recite the holy verse, Ayat al-Kursi. But the Djinn was unmoved. In a moment of sickening defiance, the possessed Laras began to recite the sacred words alongside Tika. The prayer, meant to ward off evil, was rendered useless. Tika fled the room and violently slammed the door shut. She raced to her own room, grabbed her phone, and hid inside the large wardrobe. Inside the cramped darkness, she managed to call her Oustad. Before she could explain the horror, the possessed Laras arrived in the room. Tika froze, sitting silently inside the wardrobe. Through the cracks, she watched Laras maniacally searching the room for her. Suddenly, everything went silent. Then the wardrobe door flew open. Laras lunged. Tika scrambled out of the small enclosure, escaping her mother's grip. Laras pursued her, moving with horrific speed. Laras caught up to her, her hands wrapping around Tika's throat. Desperate, Tika grabbed the nearest object and struck Laras in the head to break free. She scrambled away, finding the main exit door locked. Tika hid beneath the staircase, realizing the key was still in Laras's pocket. Laras came down the stairs, searching. Tika made a desperate lunge for the key, but Laras caught her. Laras choked her daughter, ready to squeeze the life out of her. At that critical, final moment, the Oustad rushed into the house. He immediately began reciting powerful prayers. The Djinn inside Laras grew weak and recoiled. The Oustad instructed Tika to prepare Laras and bring her immediately to the mosque. It is almost impossible to imagine the depths of this betrayal, but as the final confrontation approaches, we have to pause. If you are captivated by this Indonesian horror story, please take a moment to comment below and share your theories on how Tika will break this ancient curse. As they walked to the mosque, Tika looked down the street and saw Yuli heading toward a dilapidated, abandoned building, Salmon's lair. Tika's suspicion spiked, and she decided to follow her. Yuli was inside, preparing the final talisman, the one bearing Tika's name. Tika burst into the lair and screamed at the sight of the horror. Amber's grotesque, decaying corpse lying on the ritual floor. Yuli quickly hushed Tika, then stepped forward, eyes cold and dead. She confessed every single act. She was the one who destroyed the entire family. They wronged me since I was a child, Yuli sneered. And this is my vengeance. Tika, weeping, demanded an explanation. What had Djinn and Rudy, her brother and father, ever done to Yuli? Yuli was unmoved. She claimed the entire family had made her life a living hell. Her grandmother had always called her an illegitimate child, a branding Yuli knew was false. She then revealed a deeper, shocking truth. Amber herself had confessed to Yuli before her death that Amber was the one who used black magic to kill Yuli's mother, seeking to eliminate her rival. But that night, Yuli's father also died, leaving Yuli utterly defenseless and alone. Tika insisted she had never treated Yuli badly. She had always looked up to Yuli as her aunt. No, Yuli countered. If Tika had truly considered her family, she would have fought for her. Tika and Djinn stood silent when Yuli was abused, and for that passive complicity they deserved punishment too. Yuli laughed maniacally, calling Tika a hypocrite. Tika realized the full, terrifying scope of the betrayal. Her entire family was gone, and now her mother was dying. She ran, racing back toward the mosque. At the mosque, the Oustad had begun the Ruqyah, exorcism ceremony. The Djinn inside Laras thrashed violently. Laras's body twisted into unnatural shapes, and she screamed in agony. The roars were so intense that the surrounding people could barely endure them. The Oustad continued the recitation. Eventually, Laras vomited blood and collapsed, unconscious. Tika ran to her side, but the Oustad warned her to stay back and continue praying with the others. Simultaneously, Yuli was trying to finish the final ritual for Tika. She took the talisman bearing Tika's name and tried to sew it into the rapidly decomposing stomach area of Amber's corpse. But the black magic was unstable. Every needle she tried to use broke. Laras's inner Djinn had violently reawakened. It tried to physically attack the Oustad. The Oustad immediately intensified the Ruqyah. The Djinn was thrown backward, pinning Laras to the wall, where it screamed. The full force of the sacred Ruqyah prayers finally hit Yuli. Not only did she fail to secure Tika's talisman, but she lost control of her hands. Blood and sharp objects erupted from her mouth. The Oustad successfully expelled the Djinn from Laras. Laras fell to the floor, yet her body was still uncontrollably spasming, the Djinn having left a lingering corruption. The Oustad and the others gathered around her, continuing to pray. The prayers that had driven out the Djinn from Laras now caused the black magic to violently turn on Yuli. Her hands acted against her will. She picked up a sharp object and began to viciously slash at her own face. She fought desperately to stop her hands, but couldn't. One hand was forced to strike the other. Laras, though free of the Djinn, was suffering immense pain, begging for the torture to cease. The Oustad recognized the signs. Laras was nearing her end. He sadly instructed Tika to be strong, to pray for Laras, and to bid her farewell. Tika, devastated, recited the prayers for her dying mother while the Oustad chanted alongside her. The prayers eased Laras's final, agonizing moments. At the same time, Yuli was enduring her own hell. In her despair, she picked up a heavy stone and began violently smashing it down onto Amber's putrid corpse. But as she struck, the vision shifted. The Djinns she had summoned were now surrounding her, using the stone to beat Yuli herself. She writhed and choked in pure terror. The Oustad successfully fully banished the Djinn from Laras. In Salmon's lair, Yuli's terrifying, self-inflicted injuries intensified. Driven mad by the returning curse, Yuli used her own hands to violently sever her limbs, believing the Djinns were attacking her when in reality she was destroying herself. Yuli died a terrifying, mutilating death. The moment Yuli's life ended, Laras suffered a massive hemorrhage. She vomited copious amounts of blood, along with insects and pests, the physical remnants of the Djinn and the black magic leaving her body. Salman, sensing the rupture of the curse, realized that Yuli had been defeated. Though the evil was gone, Laras was too weak to survive. Her life force was draining away. The Oustad prompted Tika to lead her mother through istighfar, repentance. With great difficulty, Laras recited the prayers. Then Laras breathed her last, passing away in the arms of her daughter. In the span of just a few days, Tika was utterly alone. Her entire family was gone. Holding her mother's lifeless body, she screamed and wept in soul-crushing despair. The story concludes with Tika standing in the cemetery the following morning. The Oustad consoled her, urging her to remain strong and to fortify her faith. He then left her alone. Tika looked across the freshly dug earth. Grave after grave marked the final resting places of her family. They were all here now. Even Yuli's grave was visible among them. Despite the incomprehensible malice and destruction Yuli had caused, Tika made a powerful, definitive decision in her heart. She would forgive Yuli. And with that act of quiet faith and courage, Tika vowed to move forward in her shattered life. This terrifying story of ancient curses, family betrayal, and the consequences recorded in the deepest places of sin is a stark reminder that some debts demand a price higher than any person should ever have to pay. Thank you so much for joining us for this deep, detailed breakdown. We hope this chilling tale from the Kitab Sijjin offered you a truly immersive horror experience.